My grandma sold her wedding ring, and I found out what she needed. That single sentence doesn't capture the weight of what I discovered, the secret she kept buried for 8 months, or the choice I made that tore our family into pieces that may never fit back together. This story isn't just about a missing ring, or even about money. It's about the lies we tell to protect the people we love, the sacrifices that go unseen, and the moment I decided to dig for truth when maybe I should have just let sleeping dogs lie. My grandmother Margaret was born in Pennsylvania in 1948, in a coal mining town where secrets were currency and everyone knew everyone's business. She grew up learning to keep things close to the chest, to handle problems quietly, to never burden others with your troubles. That wedding ring she wore for 53 years was more than jewelry to her. My grandfather gave it to her in 1967 when he was working double shifts at the steel mill just to afford it. It was a simple gold band with 3 small diamonds, nothing fancy by today's standards, but it represented everything they built together. 4 children raised in a 2-bedroom house. Holidays celebrated around a table that barely fit everyone. A marriage that survived layoffs, health scares, financial struggles, and the ordinary wear of decades spent side by side. She wore that ring through everything, through diaper changes and dishwashing, through my grandfather's heart attack in 1989 that nearly killed him, through burying both her parents, through the day my grandfather finally did die 12 years ago, when everyone expected her to take the ring off and she looked at them like they were insane. "This ring stays on my finger until they bury me next to him," she had said with such conviction that no one ever brought it up again. Please listen to my story and tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong, because what I uncovered changed everything, destroyed trust that took decades to build, and left me wondering if some secrets are meant to stay buried. I noticed the ring was missing on a Sunday afternoon in early March. The kind of mild, hopeful spring day that makes you think winter might actually be over. I had driven to her house in Scranton to help with some yard work. She wanted to clear out the flower beds and get them ready for planting, and at 86 years old, she couldn't do the heavy lifting anymore. When I arrived, she was already outside wearing her gardening gloves, inspecting the soil in the beds along the side of the house. We worked for about 2 hours, pulling weeds, turning soil, discussing what flowers she wanted to plant this year. The usual routine. When we finished, we went inside to wash up and have lunch. That's when I saw it, or rather didn't see it. She was standing at the kitchen sink washing her hands, and I was behind her getting glasses from the cabinet. The afternoon light coming through the window above the sink hit her left hand, and something looked wrong. Her hand looked naked, empty. The little indent on her ring finger where the band had pressed into her skin for over half a century was still visible, like a ghost of what should have been there. But the ring itself was gone. I felt my stomach drop even before I fully processed what I was seeing. I asked her about it immediately, trying to keep my voice casual, even though alarm bells were already going off in my head. "Grandma, where's your ring?" She didn't turn around. She kept washing her hands, scrubbing them more thoroughly than necessary. She told me she had put it away for safekeeping, said it had gotten loose over the years, and she was worried about losing it while gardening or doing dishes. Said she didn't want to risk it slipping off and disappearing down a drain or getting lost in the dirt. The explanation made perfect sense on the surface. She was 86. Her fingers had gotten thinner with age. Rings that fit perfectly decades ago sometimes became loose. It was reasonable. It was logical. But something in her voice sounded off. A slight tremor. A hesitation. And she still hadn't turned around to look at me. She just kept drying her hands on the dish towel, taking far longer than the task required. I let it go that afternoon. I told myself I was being paranoid, reading too much into nothing. We ate lunch and talked about normal things. My kids, her church group, the neighbors, but the unease stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind during the entire drive home. My grandmother had worn that ring through everything life threw at her. She had worn it while kneading bread dough with her hands covered in flour. She had worn it while scrubbing floors on her hands and knees. She had worn it while bathing all 4 of her children as infants. She had worn it while holding my grandfather's hand as he took his last breath. She had never, not once in 53 years, taken it off for any reason. Not for safety, not for convenience, not for anything. So why now? Why would she suddenly decide after more than 5 decades that the ring needed to be put away? What had changed? The question haunted me for the next 3 days. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I replayed our conversation over and over, analyzing her tone, her body language, the way she had avoided eye contact. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, but I didn't know what to do about it. I couldn't just accuse her of lying. I couldn't demand to see the ring to prove she still had it. She would think I didn't trust her, that I was treating her like a child who needed supervision. Finally, I called my mother. Mom is the oldest of my grandmother's 4 children and usually has her finger on the pulse of what's happening in Grandma's life. They talk on the phone several times a week and visit each other regularly. If something was going on, Mom would know. But when I described what I had seen and asked if she had noticed the ring missing, Mom sounded surprised. She said she hadn't been over to visit in about 2 weeks because she had been fighting off a nasty cold and didn't want to risk getting Grandma sick. She promised to stop by in the next day or 2 and check on the situation. I asked her to be subtle about it, not to make it seem like we were monitoring Grandma or questioning her choices. Mom agreed. 3 days later, Mom called me back. Her voice was tight with concern. She had visited Grandma that afternoon, under the pretense of dropping off some homemade soup. The ring was definitely gone. When Mom casually mentioned noticing its absence, Grandma had given her the exact same explanation she had given me. Put it away, too loose, safekeeping. But Mom said Grandma had seemed irritated by the question, almost defensive, like we were prying into business that wasn't ours. Mom also mentioned something else that made my worry spike. She said there was a stack of mail on the kitchen counter that looked like bills, and several of the envelopes had that red stamping you see on past due notices. Grandma was usually meticulous about her paperwork, opening everything immediately and filing it away. The fact that bills were piling up unopened was completely out of character. That detail sent my anxiety into overdrive. My grandmother was sharp as a tack. She handled all her own finances. She paid her bills on time, balanced her checkbook monthly, kept immaculate records. She owned her house outright, drove herself to appointments, cooked her own meals, maintained her independence fiercely. If there were unopened bills accumulating on her counter, something was seriously wrong. I decided to visit her again, this time unannounced. I showed up on a Thursday morning with a bag of bagels from her favorite shop downtown and 2 coffees. She loved those bagels, and I figured bringing breakfast would make the visit seem casual and normal rather than like I was checking up on her. When I arrived, she seemed happy enough to see me. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten countless meals as a child, and talked about everyday things. The weather, her friends from church, how my kids were doing in school. Surface-level conversation that felt safe and easy. But I was watching her the whole time, really watching, looking for signs of whatever was happening beneath the surface. Her hands shook slightly when she lifted her coffee cup. There were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. She looked thinner than the last time I had seen her, like she had lost weight. And when I glanced past her toward the living room, I could see more mail stacked on the side table. Bills, envelopes with windows and red stamping. Final notice, past due. The kind of mail that makes your heart race when you see it. I asked her gently if everything was okay, if she needed help with anything, if there was something going on that she wanted to talk about. She smiled and patted my hand and told me not to worry. Everything was fine. She was fine. Just getting older, that's all. Tired more easily these days, but nothing to be concerned about. Her voice was warm and reassuring, but her eyes told a different story. They looked worried, scared even, like she was carrying something heavy and didn't know how much longer she could hold it. After I left that morning, I sat in my car in her driveway for a long time, trying to figure out what to do. I could confront her directly about the bills. I could offer to help her sort through her mail and organize her finances, but I knew my grandmother, knew how proud she was, how independent. If she thought I was treating her like she couldn't manage her own life, she would shut me out completely. She would smile and nod and tell me everything was fine, and then she would stop answering my calls and make excuses when I tried to visit. That's when the thought hit me. If she had really just put the ring away for safekeeping like she claimed, it would be somewhere in her house. In her jewelry box, probably. Or maybe in the safe deposit box she kept at the bank. But if she had sold it, there would be a record, a pawn shop receipt, a check from a jewelry buyer, some kind of paper trail. I knew snooping was wrong, knew I was crossing a line, but the worry had burrowed so deep into my chest that I couldn't breathe around it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I had to know if she was okay, or if someone was taking advantage of her, or if she was in some kind of trouble she was too proud or too scared to tell us about. I started with the local pawn shops. There were 3 in Scranton within a reasonable distance from her house. Over the next 2 days, I visited each one. I described the ring in detail. Simple gold band, 3 small diamonds, definitely vintage, probably from the late 1960s. At the first shop, the clerk barely looked up from his phone, said he hadn't seen anything like that. At the second shop, a woman behind bulletproof glass checked her computer and shook her head, nothing matching that description. But at the third shop, a small, dingy place near the old train station in a part of town that had seen better days, I got a different response. The man behind the counter was middle-aged with a thick beard and tired eyes. As soon as I finished describing the ring, he nodded. Said a woman matching my grandmother's description had brought it in about 6 weeks ago. He remembered because she had seemed nervous, kept glancing around like she didn't want anyone to see her there. He remembered the ring, too, because it was nice. Simple but well made. Real gold, real diamonds, even if they were small. I asked him how much she had gotten for it. My voice came out barely above a whisper. He pulled up the transaction on his computer and told me $450. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. That ring was easily worth $2,000, probably more. But pawn shops never pay fair value. They need to make a profit when they resell. $450 was an insult. Robbery, really. And my grandmother, who was smart about money and knew the value of things, had accepted it without argument. That told me everything I needed to know. She had needed cash immediately, desperately, badly enough to take a terrible deal on something that meant the world to her. I asked the man if he still had the ring, if I could buy it back. He checked his system and shook his head, said it had sold 3 weeks earlier to a young couple looking for an affordable engagement ring. It was gone. My grandmother's wedding ring, the symbol of 53 years of marriage and love and commitment, was now on some stranger's finger. There was no getting it back. It was lost forever. I left that pawn shop and sat in my car in the parking lot and cried. Not quietly, big, gasping sobs that shook my whole body. Not just because the ring was gone, though that was terrible enough, but because I knew what it meant. My grandmother had been desperate enough to sell the most precious thing she owned, something she had sworn would stay on her finger until the day she died. And she had done it in secret, alone, without telling anyone or asking for help. She was protecting us from something, shielding us from whatever crisis had driven her to that pawn shop. But what? What could possibly be bad enough to make her do this? I thought about those bills piling up on her counter, the unopened envelopes with red stamping. I thought about how tired she looked, how thin, how her hands shook when she lifted her coffee cup. Something was very, very wrong. and I needed to find out what it was before she lost everything. I made a decision that I'm still not entirely sure was right. 3 years ago, when Grandma had a minor health scare and spent a few days in the hospital, she had added me as a joint account holder on her bank accounts. She said it was just for emergencies, in case something happened to her and someone needed to access her money to pay bills or handle expenses. She had made me promise not to look at her accounts unless she specifically asked me to, or unless there was a genuine emergency, and I had promised. I had kept that promise for 3 years, never once checking her balances or looking at her transactions. But now I was about to break it. That night, I sat at my laptop at home with my hands shaking. I typed in the website for her bank, entered her account number and the password she had given me, hit enter, and there it was. Her financial life laid out in rows of numbers and dates. What I found made my blood run cold. Her checking account balance was $183. $183. My grandmother, who had always been so careful with money, who had maintained a healthy cushion of savings throughout her entire life, was down to barely enough to buy groceries for a week. But that wasn't even the worst part. When I pulled up her transaction history, I saw a pattern that made no sense whatsoever. Over the past 8 months, starting in July of the previous year, she had been making large cash withdrawals at regular intervals. $500 here, $1,000 there, sometimes $2,000 at a time. Always cash, always withdrawn in person at the bank branch, not from ATMs. No checks written, no wire transfers, no electronic payments that might leave a trail explaining where the money was going. Just cash withdrawals, again and again, bleeding her account dry. I scrolled back further, looking at her account history from before the withdrawals started. Her balance had been healthy, around $15,000 from the combination of her Social Security payments and my grandfather's pension that she still received as his widow. Her monthly expenses were modest: utilities, property taxes, groceries, the occasional lunch with friends from church. She lived simply. There was no reason for her to be withdrawing thousands of dollars in cash every few weeks. No expensive hobbies, no lavish purchases, no travel plans, unless she was giving it to someone. That thought hit me like a freight train. Was someone scamming her? Were those horrible people who target elderly folks with phone calls claiming to be the IRS or fake charities or supposed grandchildren in trouble? I had heard nightmare stories about seniors emptying their entire life savings because someone convinced them their grandchild was in jail in Mexico and needed bail money wired immediately. But my grandmother was smart, street smart even. She had grown up in a rough town where you learned early not to trust everyone. She wouldn't fall for something like that, would she? But then again, scammers were good. They were professionals. They knew exactly what buttons to push, what fears to exploit. And as people got older, sometimes they became more vulnerable to manipulation even if they had been sharp their whole lives. The thought of someone taking advantage of my grandmother, preying on her kindness or her fear, made me feel physically ill. I needed to tell someone. I couldn't handle this alone. I called my mother again and told her everything. About tracking the ring to the pawn shop, about the $450, about the bank account with its $183 balance, and the months of mysterious cash withdrawals. Mom was silent for a long time after I finished talking. Then she said we needed to confront Grandma. Together, soon, before she lost absolutely everything. We planned the confrontation for the following Saturday. Mom would bring Aunt Linda, Grandma's second daughter, the three of us together. It felt like an intervention, which I suppose it was. We weren't trying to gang up on her or make her feel attacked. We were trying to save her. That's what I kept telling myself. We were doing this because we loved her, because we couldn't stand by and watch her destroy herself financially while trying to protect us from whatever was happening. That Saturday morning felt heavy with dread. I picked up Mom at her house and we drove together to Aunt Linda's place across town. Linda got in the back seat and immediately asked if I was absolutely certain about what I had found. I showed her screenshots from the bank account on my phone. Transaction after transaction. Withdrawal after withdrawal. Her face went pale. She said this was worse than she had imagined. She said we needed to be gentle but firm. We needed to find out where the money was going and stop it immediately before Grandma ended up destitute. When we arrived at Grandma's house, she was clearly surprised to see all three of us together. She made a joke about not realizing we were having a family meeting, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. She knew something was up. You don't get to be 86 years old without developing good instincts about when trouble is coming. We sat in her living room, surrounded by decades of family photos on the walls, weddings and graduations and babies, birthday parties and holidays, a whole lifetime of memories accumulated in frames. The afternoon sun coming through the windows made everything look warm and peaceful, which felt wrong given what we were about to discuss. Mom started. She told Grandma we were worried about her, that we had noticed the ring was missing and wanted to make sure she was okay. Grandma tried to give us the same story about putting it away for safekeeping, but Mom didn't let her finish. She said we knew she had sold it. We knew she had gone to a pawn shop 6 weeks ago and gotten $450 for a ring worth 10 times that much. And we knew her bank account was nearly empty after months of large cash withdrawals. The look that came over Grandma's face is something I will never forget as long as I live. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even embarrassment. It was defeat. Pure, absolute defeat. Like she had been holding up an enormous weight for months and had finally run out of strength. Her shoulders sagged, her face crumpled. She slumped back in her chair and closed her eyes. For a moment, I genuinely thought she might cry right there. But she didn't. She just sat there in silence, breathing slowly, like she was trying to gather the energy to respond. Aunt Linda asked where the money was going, asked if someone was scamming her or threatening her, asked if she needed help. But Grandma just shook her head slowly without opening her eyes. She said it was her business, her money, her choice. She told us to leave it alone, to let her handle her own affairs. But we couldn't leave it alone. Not when she had sold her wedding ring. Not when she was down to $183 in her checking account. Not when she was clearly in crisis and too proud or too scared to ask for help. I leaned forward and took her hand. It felt small and fragile in mine. I told her we loved her. Told her we weren't trying to control her or take away her independence. Told her we just wanted to understand what was happening so we could help. Told her she didn't have to carry this burden alone. That's when she finally broke. Tears started rolling down her cheeks, quiet and steady. She pulled her hand away from mine and covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders shook. She cried in a way I had never seen her cry before. Not when my grandfather died, not at any funeral or crisis or heartbreak. This was deeper. This was the kind of crying that comes from months of holding something inside until it finally breaks through. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet we had to lean in close to hear her. She said the money was for Derek, her youngest child, her baby, Derek, who was 52 years old. Derek, who had struggled with drug addiction for most of his adult life. Derek, who had been in and out of rehab programs, in and out of jobs, in and out of relationships that fell apart because of his addiction. Derek, who we all thought was doing better because he had been clean for 3 years and was working steadily at a construction company in Ohio. Grandma told us that Derek had called her 8 months ago, back in July. He was in trouble, serious trouble. He said he owed money to dangerous people, people who were threatening him. He said if he didn't pay them back, they were going to hurt him, maybe kill him. He needed $20,000. He needed it fast. And he begged her not to tell anyone in the family because he was so ashamed. He didn't want us to know he had relapsed, didn't want us to be disappointed in him again. didn't want us to give up on him completely. So Grandma had started sending him money. She had emptied her savings account first. $5,000 gone in 2 weeks. When that wasn't enough, she started making cash withdrawals from her checking account. $1,000 here, $2,000 there. She sent it all to Derek through Western Union. He kept telling her it was almost enough. Just a little more, just one more payment, and he would be safe. But the number kept growing. The people he supposedly owed kept demanding more. When her savings was gone and her checking account was getting dangerously low, when she had nothing left to send, she sold the ring, her wedding ring, the symbol of 53 years of marriage to the man she had loved more than anything. She took it to that pawn shop and accepted $450 because Derek said he needed just a little bit more. Just one more payment to be safe. She gave up the last piece of her husband she had left to try to save her son. But even that wasn't enough. Derek kept calling, kept saying the people wanted more, kept saying he was in danger. And Grandma, who was 86 years old and terrified of losing her youngest child, kept trying to find ways to scrape together more money. She had started skipping meals to save on groceries. She had turned her thermostat down to save on heating bills, even though it was still cold at night. She had stopped going to lunch with her church friends because she couldn't afford it. She was doing everything she could to find money to send to Ohio. When Grandma finished telling us all of this, the room fell into a heavy silence. None of us knew what to say. Part of me was furious at Derek, enraged that he would manipulate his own mother like this. Part of me was heartbroken that Grandma had been carrying this burden alone for 8 months. And part of me was terrified because I knew what everyone else in that room was thinking. We were all thinking the same thing. Derek was lying. There were no dangerous people. There was no debt. Derek had relapsed. He was using again. And he was using Grandma's money to buy drugs. He was manipulating her, playing on her love and her fear, bleeding her dry one cash withdrawal at a time. And she either couldn't see it or didn't want to see it, because the alternative, that her baby boy was really in danger, was too terrifying to contemplate. Mom asked Grandma when she had last actually seen Derek or talked to him on video. Grandma said she hadn't. He always called from different numbers. He said the people he owed were watching him, and he had to be careful about communications. He said he couldn't do video calls because it wasn't safe. He said he would visit as soon as this was all over, but it wasn't safe yet. He just needed a little more money, and then everything would be okay. Aunt Linda asked if Grandma had any proof that Derek was really in danger. Police reports, documentation, anything concrete. Grandma shook her head. She said Derek told her not to involve the police because it would make things worse. The people he owed had connections. If police got involved, Derek would definitely end up dead. She just had to trust him, just had to keep sending money until the debt was paid off. I asked Grandma how much money she had sent him in total. She looked away, not wanting to answer, but Mom pushed gently but firmly. She said we needed to know the full extent of this so we could figure out how to help. Grandma whispered a number that made my stomach turn. $23,000. She had sent Derek $23,000 over 8 months. Her entire life savings, her security, her future, everything she and my grandfather had worked for and saved over 53 years of marriage. All of it gone. And Derek wanted more. He had called just 2 days earlier asking for another $5,000. He said this would be the last payment, the final one. After this, the debt would be clear, and he would be safe, and he would come visit, and everything would go back to normal. But Grandma didn't have $5,000. She didn't have $500. She had nothing left to give him, and the desperation in her voice when she told us this was crushing. Now this is where I did something that I want you to advise me if I was right or wrong. I told Grandma I was going to Ohio to find Derek. I was going to see him face to face and figure out what was really happening. If he was truly in danger, we would help him properly. We would involve the police. We would get him protection. We would do whatever was necessary to keep him safe. But if he was lying, if he was using again and manipulating his mother, then it needed to stop. Right now. Immediately. Before Grandma ended up losing her house or going hungry because she had literally nothing left. Grandma begged me not to go. She grabbed my hand and held it tight and told me I would make things worse. She said Derek had specifically told her not to tell the family. She said if I showed up in Ohio, the people he owed might find out and hurt him. She said I could be putting his life at risk, but I didn't believe it anymore. I couldn't believe it. I had seen too many red flags. I had watched Derek manipulate our family too many times over the years. I had heard too many promises that he was getting clean, doing better, turning his life around. And every single time, he had fallen back into the same patterns. Mom and Aunt Linda agreed with me. They said someone needed to confront Derek directly and get the truth out of him, but both of them had work obligations. Mom had a major project deadline at her job. Linda had a work trip scheduled that she couldn't cancel. I was the only one with a flexible enough schedule to leave immediately. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer. I could rearrange my deadlines and work remotely from Ohio if needed. I told them I would drive there the next day. I would find Derek and get answers one way or another. Grandma cried harder. She kept saying I was making a terrible mistake. She kept saying I didn't understand how dangerous this was. But I hugged her tight and told her it would be okay. Told her I was doing this because I loved her. Because I couldn't stand by and watch her sacrifice everything for someone who might be lying to her. I promised to be careful. I promised to stay safe. But I was going to Ohio whether she liked it or not. I left her house that day with a heavy heart and a knot of dread in my stomach. I called my husband on the drive home and told him everything. He was supportive but worried. He said I should be careful. He said if there really were dangerous people involved, I could be walking into something bad. But I told him I didn't think that was the case. I thought Derek was alone somewhere, high and desperate, making up stories to get money from the one person who would never say no to him. The next morning, I packed a bag with enough clothes for 3 or 4 days and started the drive to Ohio. Derek lived in a town called Marietta, about 4 hours southwest of Scranton. I had only been there once before, years ago when he first moved there for a construction job. He lived in a cheap apartment near the Ohio River. I had the address because Grandma had given it to me, though she had made me promise not to tell Derek that I had it. The drive felt endless. I kept rehearsing what I would say to him, how I would confront him without losing my temper, how I would make him understand the damage he was doing, how I would get him to admit the truth. But the closer I got to Marietta, the more nervous I became. What if I was wrong? What if Derek really was in danger? What if showing up at his apartment put him at risk or made everything worse? What if Grandma was right and I was making a terrible mistake? But then I thought about her face when she told us about selling the ring, the way she had cried, the defeat in her voice. And I knew I had to do this, even if I was wrong, even if Derek was telling the truth. I needed to see him with my own eyes. I needed to look at him and know, really know, what was happening. I arrived in Marietta around 2 in the afternoon. The town was small and depressed looking. Old factories that had closed decades ago stood empty along the river. Storefronts were boarded up downtown. The whole place had that feeling of somewhere that used to be something but wasn't anymore. Derek's apartment building was a 3-story brick structure that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Peeling paint, cracked concrete steps, rusted railings. I parked on the street and sat in my car for several minutes, gathering my courage. Then I got out and walked to the building entrance. The directory in the lobby listed his apartment as Unit 205 on the 2nd floor. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I reached his door, I could hear a television playing inside. Someone was home. I knocked firmly 3 times. No response. I waited 30 seconds and knocked again, louder this time. I heard movement inside. Footsteps approaching. Then the door opened a crack and Derek's face appeared. He looked terrible. His hair was greasy and unwashed. His eyes were bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. He had lost significant weight, and his skin had that grayish, unhealthy tone that comes from not seeing sunlight or eating properly for a long time. He stared at me for a long moment like he couldn't quite process that I was really standing there. Then he started to close the door. I jammed my foot in the gap and pushed back. I told him we needed to talk. He said he didn't have time. He said I needed to leave right now, but I didn't move. I told him I knew about the money. I knew what he had been doing to Grandma, and I wasn't leaving until he told me the truth. He looked behind him nervously, like maybe someone else was in the apartment. Then he stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind him. He crossed his arms over his chest defensively and leaned against the wall. He looked at me with a mix of anger and shame and exhaustion. He asked what I wanted. I asked him point blank if he was using again, if he was on drugs, if he had spent $23,000 of Grandma's money feeding an addiction. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the grimy carpet. Then he laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound with no humor in it. He said, of course, I thought the worst of him. He said the whole family always assumed he was screwing up. He said nobody ever believed he could actually change or get better. I told him that wasn't fair. We had supported him through every rehab program, every relapse, every promise to do better. We had never given up on him completely, even when we had every reason to. But he had broken our trust over and over again, and now he was taking money from an 86-year-old woman who had nothing left. I told him Grandma had sold her wedding ring because of him. Did he even know that? Did he even care? That ring meant everything to her, and she sold it to a pawn shop for $450 to send him more money. His face changed when I said that. The defiance cracked. He looked genuinely shocked and horrified. He asked what I meant. So I told him everything. About finding the ring missing, about tracking it to the pawn shop, about the insulting amount she had gotten for something worth so much more, about her bank account being down to $183, about the unopened bills piling up on her counter. Derek slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor in the hallway. He put his head in his hands. He said he didn't know. He said he didn't realize it had gotten that bad. He said he never wanted to hurt her. And for the first time since I arrived, I thought he might actually be telling me something true. I sat down on the floor across from him. I told him to tell me what was really going on. No more lies, no more excuses, no more manipulation, just the complete truth. And after a long silence where I could hear him breathing heavily, he started talking. He told me he hadn't relapsed. He really had been clean for 3 years. He really did have a steady job with the construction company. But 8 months ago, his daughter had gotten sick. Emma, Derek's daughter from his first marriage, a girl who was 16 years old and lived with her mother in Michigan. I barely knew Emma existed. Derek's first marriage had ended badly years ago, and he had lost touch with that side of his life. But Emma was his kid, his daughter. Emma had been diagnosed with leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, to be specific. The treatment was aggressive and expensive. Her mother, Derek's ex-wife, had health insurance through her job, but it didn't cover everything. The copays were astronomical. There were experimental treatments that the insurance company kept denying, travel costs to get to specialists in bigger cities, medications that weren't on the approved list. It was adding up to tens of thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket expenses that Emma's mother couldn't afford. She had called Derek in desperation, asking if he could help. She knew he didn't have much money. She knew his history. But Emma was his daughter, and she was dying. Derek had tried to help. He sent what little savings he had managed to accumulate over his 3 years of sobriety, about $3,000, but it wasn't nearly enough. The medical bills kept piling up. Emma's mother was working 2 jobs just to keep up with the minimum payments on the medical debt, and Emma was suffering. She needed a specific treatment that the insurance company had denied 3 times, a treatment that could significantly improve her chances of survival. But it cost $18,000 out of pocket. Derek didn't have $18,000. He barely made enough to cover his own rent and basic expenses. But he couldn't let his daughter die. He couldn't just do nothing. So he called the one person he knew would help him no matter what. His mother, Grandma. He told her he was in trouble, that he owed money to dangerous people. He made up that entire story because he was ashamed that he couldn't provide for his own daughter, ashamed that his ex-wife had to beg him for money, ashamed that he was such a failure as a father. He thought if Grandma believed he was in physical danger, that his life was being threatened, she would be more willing to help. And she was. She sent him everything she had. Derek used every single dollar to pay for Emma's medical care. Not 1 penny went to drugs. Not 1 penny was wasted. Every cash withdrawal Grandma made, every dollar she scraped together, went directly to hospitals and doctors and pharmacies in Michigan. He was trying to save his daughter's life, but the costs kept growing. Every time he thought they were done, there was another bill, another treatment, another expense. And he kept going back to Grandma because he didn't know what else to do. When Derek finished talking, he was crying. Real tears, not the manipulative kind I had seen from him before during previous relapses. He said he knew what he had done was wrong. He knew lying to Grandma was terrible, but he didn't know how else to save Emma. He said he would have done anything, sold everything he owned, begged on the streets. He couldn't lose his daughter. I sat there on that dirty hallway floor not knowing how to feel. Part of me was relieved that Derek wasn't using drugs. Part of me understood why he had lied, but part of me was still angry. Angry that he hadn't just told the truth from the beginning. Angry that he had let Grandma sacrifice her wedding ring and her entire life savings without knowing what it was really for. Because if he had just been honest, we could have helped. The whole family could have pitched in. We could have figured something out together instead of letting one 86-year-old woman carry the entire burden. I asked Derek why he didn't tell us, why he didn't ask the whole family for help instead of lying to Grandma. He said he was embarrassed. After years of being the family screw-up, the addict, the disappointment, he didn't want to come crawling back asking for more help. He wanted to handle it himself. He wanted to prove he could be a good father without needing the family to bail him out again. But he had failed. He had ended up taking money from the one person who could least afford to give it. I asked about Emma, how she was doing now. Derek's face softened slightly. He said she was responding well to the treatment. The experimental therapy had worked better than anyone expected. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. She had a real chance of beating the leukemia, but there were still more treatments needed, more follow-up appointments, more medications. The bills weren't over yet, and Derek had no idea how he was going to pay for them now that Grandma had nothing left to give. I told Derek we needed to tell the family the truth, all of it. We needed to explain what the money had been for and ask everyone to help with the remaining costs. He resisted at first. He said he didn't want charity. He didn't want pity. He didn't want everyone looking at him like he was a failure again. But I told him this wasn't about his pride anymore. This was about Emma. This was about Grandma. This was about fixing the damage his lies had caused. We went back into his apartment so I could see proof of what he was telling me. The place was small and sparse, a studio with barely any furniture, but his kitchen table was covered in medical bills and insurance statements, hospital invoices from Michigan, receipts for medications, printouts of treatment plans. And on his refrigerator, held up with magnets, were photos of Emma, a beautiful teenage girl who had lost all her hair to chemotherapy but still managed to smile in the pictures. My cousin, a girl I barely knew because Derek had drifted away from that part of his life. But she was family, and she was fighting for her life. I took photos of everything with my phone: the medical bills, the insurance denials, the payment receipts showing where Grandma's money had actually gone. I told Derek I was going to share all of this with Mom and Aunt Linda and Grandma. I was going to tell them the complete truth this time. No more lies, no more hiding. We were going to face this as a family the way we should have from the very beginning. Derek nodded slowly. He looked exhausted, defeated, but maybe also a little bit relieved, like he had been carrying a secret too heavy for one person to bear, and was finally allowed to set it down. I drove back to Pennsylvania that same evening. I couldn't stay in that depressing town another minute. The 4-hour drive home felt even longer than the drive there. I called Mom from the car and told her everything Derek had said. She was silent for a long time after I finished. Then she said we needed to have a family meeting, a real one this time. With all of Grandma's children, with all of the adult grandchildren who could contribute financially, we needed to figure out how much money Emma still needed and divide the cost among everyone so no single person was carrying the whole burden. That meeting happened 3 days later at Mom's house. All 4 of Grandma's children came: my 2 uncles, Tom and Frank, my Aunt Linda, my mom, plus me and my 3 older cousins, who had decent jobs and could help with expenses. Grandma didn't attend. She said she was too tired. But I think she was also ashamed. Ashamed that Derek had lied to her. Ashamed that she had fallen for the lies. Ashamed that she had lost everything. I presented all the information I had gathered in Ohio. I showed them the photos of medical bills and treatment records. I showed them pictures of Emma, pale and bald but smiling bravely. I explained that Derek had lied about being in danger, but that every penny of Grandma's money had gone to legitimate medical expenses for his daughter. I explained that he had been too proud and too ashamed to ask the family for help because he didn't want to be seen as a failure again. The reactions were mixed. Uncle Tom was furious at Derek. He said there was no excuse for lying to their mother like that. He said Derek should have been honest from the start, regardless of his pride. Uncle Frank was more sympathetic. He said he understood panic. He said when your child is sick, you'll do anything. My Aunt Linda was focused on solutions. She said we needed to stop arguing about what Derek should have done and start figuring out how to fix the situation now. We spent nearly 3 hours going through all the documentation and calculating costs. Emma needed approximately $12,000 more to cover the remaining treatments, medications, and follow-up care. After that, her mother's insurance would adequately cover ongoing maintenance care. We divided the $12,000 among everyone at the table based on what each person could reasonably afford to contribute. Some people pledged $1,000. Some pledged $2,000. I pledged $1,500. By the end of the meeting, we had commitments for the full amount. But then the conversation shifted to Grandma. Aunt Linda pointed out that even with Emma's medical bills handled, Grandma was still in crisis. She had $183 to her name. She had sold her wedding ring. She was skipping meals and turning down her heat to save money. We couldn't just fix Derek's problem and leave Grandma destitute. Uncle Tom said Derek should pay her back, every penny, $23,000. He should get a second job if necessary and work to repay what he had taken. But Uncle Frank pointed out that Derek was barely surviving on his current income. He couldn't pay back that kind of money, not for years, maybe not for decades. And Grandma couldn't wait that long. She needed help immediately. We decided that each of Grandma's 4 children would contribute $500 per month to rebuild her savings. That would give her $2,000 monthly on top of her Social Security and pension. It wouldn't replace everything she had lost overnight, but it would get her financially stable again. We agreed to continue the contributions until she had at least $10,000 saved again. It would take time, but it was doable. There was one condition, though. Uncle Tom insisted on it, and everyone eventually agreed. Derek needed to apologize to Grandma in person, face to face. He needed to admit what he had done, explain the real reason for the lies, and ask for her forgiveness. And he needed to promise never to ask her for money again without being completely honest about what it was for. No more lies, no more manipulation, even if the truth was hard or embarrassing. We arranged for Derek to come to Pennsylvania the following weekend. He would stay at Grandma's house and have a private conversation with her, just the two of them. The rest of us agreed to stay out of it and let them work through it without interference. That week crawled by. I checked on Grandma every day, making sure she was eating, making sure she was okay. She seemed withdrawn, quiet, processing everything, the betrayal, the lies, but also probably the relief of knowing Derek wasn't in danger. The relief of knowing her money had saved Emma's life instead of feeding an addiction. When that Saturday arrived, I drove over to Grandma's house, even though I had promised to stay away during Derek's visit. I just wanted to make sure he actually showed up. I wanted to make sure he didn't back out at the last minute. I parked down the street and waited. About 20 minutes later, Derek's beat-up truck pulled into her driveway. I walked over and met him before he could knock on the door. He looked nervous. Terrified, actually. I told him it would be okay. Told him Grandma loved him and would eventually forgive him. But he needed to be completely honest with her this time. Every detail, every truth. No more protecting her from hard realities. He nodded and walked to the front door. I got back in my car and drove away. I didn't want to hover. This conversation needed to happen without any of us interfering. Derek called me 3 hours later. His voice was hoarse from crying. He said it had been one of the hardest conversations of his life. He said Grandma had cried. He had cried. They had both said things that needed to be said. Painful things. True things. He had shown her pictures of Emma. Explained the diagnosis and the treatments and the costs. Explained why he had lied and how sorry he was. And Grandma had listened. Really listened. She had told him she forgave him. But she also told him he had broken her heart. Not because of the money. Money could be rebuilt. But because he hadn't trusted her with the truth. He had treated her like she was too fragile to handle reality. And that hurt worse than losing the ring or the savings. She said if he had just told her from the beginning that Emma was sick, she would have given him everything anyway. But she would have known what she was sacrificing for. She would have been part of the solution instead of a victim of deception. Derek promised her it would never happen again, promised to always be honest no matter how hard the truth was, and Grandma had hugged him and told him she loved him. She said she was proud that he had stayed clean and held down a job and tried to help his daughter. She said those were good things, even if his methods had been wrong. Over the next few weeks, the family came together in a way we hadn't in years. Everyone contributed their pledged amounts for Emma's medical bills. The money was sent directly to the hospitals and billing departments in Michigan. Emma's mother called Derek, crying with relief. For the first time in months, she could breathe. The immediate financial crisis was over. The monthly contributions to rebuild Grandma's savings started. $2,000 appeared in her account like clockwork. She was able to buy groceries without anxiety. She turned her heat back up. She started going to lunch with her church friends again. Slowly, carefully, she was rebuilding. But something had changed in our family. Something fundamental. The lies and the secrecy had cracked the foundation of trust we had all built over decades. Uncle Tom barely spoke to Derek anymore. He showed up for family gatherings but kept his distance, his face hard with unresolved anger. My mother tried to play peacemaker, but you could see the strain in her eyes. Aunt Linda threw herself into organizing everything, probably as a way to avoid dealing with her own feelings about what had happened. And Grandma, despite forgiving Derek, seemed diminished somehow, smaller. The ring's absence on her finger was a constant reminder of what had been lost. Not just the physical object, but the sense of security and stability she had maintained her entire adult life. She had always been the strong one, the matriarch, the person everyone turned to in crisis. Now, she was the one who needed help, and I don't think she ever quite got over that shift. The worst part, though, was what happened between me and some other family members. Uncle Tom blamed me for getting involved in the first place. He said if I had just minded my own business, Grandma could have handled it her way. He said I had exposed family business that should have stayed private. We had a huge argument about it at Thanksgiving that year. We barely spoke after that. My cousin Rachel, Uncle Frank's daughter, took Derek's side completely. She said I had humiliated him by showing up in Ohio unannounced. She said I had violated his privacy and treated him like a criminal. She stopped inviting me to family events. Her kids and my kids used to play together all the time. Now they never see each other. Even some of Grandma's friends at church heard about what happened through the small-town gossip mill. I overheard two of them talking about it once when I went to pick Grandma up after service. They were saying how terrible it was that families couldn't keep their business private anymore. How young people today had no respect for handling things quietly. I knew they meant me. I knew I had become the villain in some people's version of this story. My husband tried to be supportive, but even he admitted he wasn't sure I had done the right thing. He said maybe I should have talked to more family members before confronting Derek. Maybe I should have tried a gentler approach. Maybe I should have given Grandma more time to handle it herself before intervening. His doubts made my own doubts grow. Derek and I have an awkward relationship now. He's grateful that I helped expose the truth so the family could rally around Emma. But he's also resentful that I invaded his privacy and forced him into a humiliating situation. We're polite to each other at family gatherings, but there's no warmth there anymore. No real connection. And Emma, sweet Emma, who survived leukemia and is now thriving. I've met her a few times since all this happened. She's a lovely girl, smart and kind and grateful to be alive. But when she looks at me, I wonder if she knows I'm the one who almost derailed the money that saved her life. If Derek had kept lying for a few more weeks if I hadn't confronted him, would Grandma have found a way to send that last $5,000 he asked for? Would it have made a difference in Emma's treatment? I'll never know, and that uncertainty haunts me. Grandma lived for 2 more years after all this happened. She passed away last spring at 88 years old, peacefully, in her sleep, which was a mercy. At her funeral, I kept thinking about that ring, about how it should have been on her finger when they buried her next to my grandfather, about how my intervention, my investigation, my insistence on exposing the truth had led to her losing that one piece of him she had left. During the reception after the funeral, Uncle Tom cornered me in the church basement. He was slightly drunk and angry in the way people get when grief has nowhere else to go. He said I had broken Grandma's heart. He said she never really recovered from the betrayal and the loss of her savings and the humiliation of the whole family knowing her business. He said I should have left well enough alone. Then he walked away before I could respond. I don't know if he was right. I still don't know if I made the right choice. I uncovered the truth. I helped mobilize the family to save Emma's life and rebuild Grandma's finances. Those are good things, objectively good outcomes. But the cost was enormous. The trust that shattered, the relationships that broke, the resentments that still simmer under the surface at every family gathering. The fact that some people in my family will never forgive me for exposing secrets that maybe should have stayed buried. Please tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to confront my grandmother about selling her wedding ring, because this decision didn't just end her honeymoon early. It cost her the husband she loved, turned our parents against me, and left our family so fractured that my own children haven't spoken to their cousins in 2 years. And I'm sure she won't be inviting me to her next birthday party this year.